All right, so the first thing that's really important is to remember that sine graphs are going to start at the origin. And they're always going to make this little S shape, and they will always end at that period. So when we find the period and the amplitude, this little curve is going to go as high as the amplitude, back through halfway between the period and the original spot we started. And then it's going to curve down, like the other part of this big S shape. It's going to curve down to the bottom of the amplitude and back up till it ends at the period. So it ends up making this S shape. And it doesn't stop there, it keeps going. And every single time we write one, that entire shape stretches across one period. Okay? So the cosine graph is different because the cosine graph starts at the amplitude. So when we know what the amplitude is, we'll just pretend this is where our amplitude starts. The amplitude tells me how high and how low we're going to go on the graph. So I'm going to go from this point, cosine makes the same shape, but we actually only see this part of it. It sort of takes this part and moves it over. So it's going to look exactly the same as that S curve made. Still an S, but this one looks more like a U because of the way we start it. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going down so that it ends up about halfway between. It should probably go just as low as this one does. And back up until it's made like a V or a U shape. It looks really weird because I have two graphs on here and none of the amplitude and none of the period. So let me show you one that actually works. Okay, so now I have an actual equation to work with. I've got f of x equals -2 sine of 6x. So the only way I can graph this on my coordinate plane, my x-axis and my y-axis, is if I find out what the period is and the amplitude. So remember, to find the period, you're going to use 2 pi over the absolute value of b. To find the amplitude, you're taking the absolute value of a. Well, if you remember from the original form of the equation in the first video, this is basically what we've got. There's also a plus c or minus c plus d. That's just in case there are things added or subtracted after the sign. In this case, we don't have that, so there is no c or d in this one. We just have to worry about a and b. So when we line it up like this, we can clearly see that a is -2 and b is +6. So I can find the period and the amplitude now using that information. And I'm going to use it just right here. So the period is going to be 2 pi over b. And b is 6. It also wants the absolute value of b. So keep in mind, if it's negative, you need to make it positive. Since it's already positive, we already have the absolute value. I just make it go away. Now I need to reduce my fraction, of course. 2 goes into 6 3 times, and it goes into itself 1 time. So we're left with pi over 3, and that's going to be our period. So I'm going to come up here and change the period to pi over 3. And I'm going to use that information to graph in just a second. And now I've got the amplitude. So I have a is -2. The amplitude is the absolute value of a. So to find the amplitude, I need to take the absolute value of -2. Anytime you take an absolute value, you're telling me how far away that number is from 0. So basically, it's always going to be positive because we're not worried about whether it's lower than 0 or higher than 0. We're just worried about how far away it is from 0. So our amplitude is 2. guide for us. Now I have my equation. I know my period and my amplitude, so I can graph it. Remember, this is a sine graph, so it's going to start at the origin, and it's going to make an S curve. I know it's a sideways S, but basically it's making an S curve. Turn yourself sideways. They're called waves. It's a sine wave, and then there's the cosine wave. This wave starts down here, but I need my period and my amplitude. So my period is pi over 3. The period tells me how far until I finish my curve. So I need to get to pi over 3. But remember, I need to go up and then down and back up. So I always divide it into 4 parts. It doesn't matter what those parts are at the moment. What I need to worry about is my curve has to go through this and back up so that I am successful. Watch that again because I did it wrong the first time. So we're going to start at the origin. We're going to go up, down, and back up. But I need to go up and down to the amplitude. That's how I know how far I'm going up or down. Since our amplitude is 2, we know we're going to go as high as 2 and as low as -2. Starting at our origin, I'm going to make my curve go all the way up until it gets to 2, and then it comes back down until it gets to -2, and then it goes back up until it gets to pi over 3. Notice I broke this into 4 sections because it's going to cross the axis right at that middle section. It's going to curve and go back the other direction right at this first mark, and it's going to curve and go back the other direction at that third mark. So the reason I divide it into 4 marks is so that I can see where my graph is going to start curving. That's all I need to do.